You should have never been born, my dad told me while handing my brother the CEO role. I just smiled and said, this company exists because of me. 2 weeks later, I pulled the funding and watched it all burn down. Hey, Reddit. I was 29 when my father shattered whatever sliver of respect I still held for him. It was supposed to be a monumental day. The boardroom filled with years of legacy, the polished mahogany table glinting under the midday sun, and the walls echoing the hushed excitement of senior executives who'd seen this company built from nothing. My company, I didn't sit in that room as just his son. I sat there as the architect of its modern-day success 10 years ago. This place was limping a relic in a digital world. My father refused to modernize, stuck in his old ways, running things like it was still the 90s when I returned from university with a dual degree in software engineering and business analytics. I pitched an idea that would shift our company from hardware manufacturing into SaaS platforms for enterprise solutions. He laughed at first, mocked me, but I pushed, I begged, I fought, and eventually he gave in. It took years of sleepless nights, missed birthdays, and a long trail of relationships that fell apart. Because I prioritized this company, my ideas worked, our profits tripled in 3 years, we landed contracts with global firms, and our brands suddenly mattered again. My strategies, my vision, it was all mine. The board praised him, sure, but everyone knew who was behind the numbers. Everyone except him. So on that day when I walked into the conference room expecting the formal transition to CEO, something he'd been dangling in front of me for months, I felt oddly calm, confident. But that calm evaporated when he stood in front of everyone, placed his hand on my younger brother's shoulder, and said, I'm proud to announce that Daniel will be taking over as CEO of the company. There was a pause in the room, the kind of awkward silence that hums with disbelief. My brother Daniel, the guy who spent the last 5 years hopping from failed startups to backpacking in Bali, returning only when he ran out of money, he knew nothing about enterprise software. He could barely sit through a budget meeting without scrolling through his phone. I laughed. I honestly thought it was a joke until I met my father's eyes cold, calculating, and then he said it. You should have never been born. You've always been a threat, not a son. You think you're smarter than me. You think you built this. You were just a tool. That sentence burned more than anything else. I didn't respond immediately. I looked around the room. A few people couldn't meet my gaze. A few looked downright horrified. Daniel looked uncomfortable, but not enough to step down. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't yell or flip the table. I just smiled, nodded, and walked out of the room. They thought I'd take it like a gut punch and come crawling back for scraps. What they didn't know was that I had leverage, real leverage. I had been the one who brought in the outside investors when the company was on the verge of bankruptcy, but I didn't just bring them in. I became one of them through shell companies and angel funds. I secured quiet majority influence in the funding pool that kept our R&D and global expansions alive. Without that funding, they couldn't breathe without me. The company was a bloated corpse pretending to live for 2 weeks. I disappeared, no contact, no reaction. I let them settle into their new regime. I watched the press releases the marketing fluff. Daniel's awkward interviews where he paired words he didn't understand. I waited until the financial quarter reset, and then I made the call. The investors pulled out. Every one of them, project funds froze. Salaries went unpaid. Contracts got terminated due to breach of delivery. Suppliers started filing lawsuits. And through it all, I watched my father try to scramble to beg to salvage something. But the financial lifelines I had built had roots deeper than he understood one by one. The systems I had put in place collapsed without the right maintenance. The board turned on him, shareholders called emergency meetings, and my brother, he vanished, deleted social media. Last I heard, he fled to Europe, trying to find himself again. The final blow came when one of the core clients sued for breach of security protocol, a protocol I had designed and which they tried to alter without understanding it. That lawsuit alone was enough to send the company's stock into a tailspin. My father was forced to step down in disgrace. I walked into his office the day after he was alone. No assistants, no executives, just him and a bottle of whiskey. He didn't even look up. You really did it. He said no. I replied, I just let you fail. You did the rest. I turned to leave, but before I walked out, I paused at the door. The company survived because of me. You. Just held the pen. I wrote the story. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. But as I walked out, something strange happened. I didn't feel the victory. I thought I would. There was no rush, no thrill, just a hollow silence that trailed behind me like a shadow. Something about the way he had looked at me. Not with hatred, but with fear. Or maybe guilt. It knotted at the edges of my mind. That night I returned home and opened an encrypted backup I had kept hidden for years. It contained all the old company documents, including internal memos, board meeting transcriptions, and most importantly, my mother's records. She had once been a silent shareholder, someone my father had methodically erased from company history after she died. But as I sifted through those records, I found names of shell accounts, secret transfers, evidence of intellectual property, theft, and buried deep in one report from over 15 years ago, a sealed file marked confidential. It detailed an internal investigation into the company's origin patents. Patents that weren't my father's. They were hers, my mother. She had created the foundation. She was the true founder of the company, and my father had stolen everything from her when she became ill. The implications shattered everything I thought I knew. My mother had designed the original tech that led to our success. My father took it, repackaged it under his name, and built a throne off of her genius. He then buried her legacy, including locking me out of her inheritance and claiming she left no stake in the company. No wonder he saw me as a threat. I was her son, and maybe in more ways than I realized, her living legacy. I had inherited not just her intellect, but her fire. Suddenly, his decision to appoint Daniel made twisted sense. Daniel wasn't a threat. He was compliant. He was his. I was a walking reminder of everything he stole, and everything he feared would one day be exposed. And now, with the company in ashes and the truth flickering to life in the documents I held in my hands, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. I hadn't just destroyed his empire out of revenge. I had unknowingly avenged my mother's eraser. But something told me there was more buried in the past, more lies, more secrets, and one file. One final sealed file on the encrypted drive had a date just 3 months before my mother died. It was time to find out what really happened. For hours, I just stared at the final sealed file. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding like I was about to detonate a bomb. And in many ways the file had a simple name transition protocol. March 14th, that date meant nothing to most people. But to me, it was the day everything changed. It was the day my mother collapsed in her office, and 2 weeks later she was dead. Officially, it was an aneurysm, sudden, tragic, but nothing about that day had ever felt right. I remembered the way my father had swept into the hospital, already making arrangements. I remembered the hush attitude around the company, the immediate restructuring, and most of all, how quickly she was erased from every piece of company literature like she had never existed. I finally opened the file. What I found inside turned my stomach. The transition protocol was a detailed legal document drawn up and signed by my father and 3 other senior executives, outlining how control of the company would be transferred to my father in the event of my mother's incapacitation or death. It was dated exactly 1 day before she collapsed. 1 day it had her forged signature. But worse than that, attached to the file was an audio recording. The file was corrupted, but partially recoverable. It was surveillance audio. You could hear my mother arguing. Her voice was sharp, urgent, defiant. She was accusing someone of stealing code. The code she had written, the software blueprint that launched our first $1 million contract. Then came another voice, my father's, calm, icy, telling her to stop pushing, to stop asking questions, that she was becoming a problem. The last part of the recording cut off mid-sentence, but not before she screamed the word betrayal. I sat in silence, gripping the edges of my desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had suspected foul play, but now there was no doubt in my mind. He hadn't just betrayed me. He hadn't just erased her legacy. He had orchestrated it quietly, ruthlessly, and with the kind of precision only a man like him could execute. I was no longer just seeking justice. I was staring into the ruins of a lie my entire life had been built on. I had dismantled his empire, thinking I was destroying a monument to arrogance. In truth, I had toppled a monument built on stolen genius and silenced brilliance. My mother didn't just help build the company. She was the company, her fingerprints were in the code, in the strategy. In the vision, he had taken everything from her and then tried to erase her bloodline by handing the throne to a fool, just so he wouldn't have to face a reflection of the woman he could never control. Over the next week, I got to work quietly. I gathered every document, every trace of her work, every recording, every signed agreement. I reached out to two of the original engineers who had worked under her men, who had quietly retired after her death. One of them, an old man named Isif, broke down in tears when I told him who I was. He told me my mother was the most brilliant strategist he had ever met, that she fought like hell for her ideas, even when the board pushed back, and that yes, she suspected they were planning to take her out of the picture. Not just professionally, I recorded everything. Then I filed suit, not quietly this time. I went public. I leaked the audio. I published her original patents. I exposed the forged signatures. The tech world exploded. Shareholders turned their fury from confusion to rage. My father's legacy disintegrated in the public eye. In less than 48 hours, I attended the hearing in a sleek black suit, no emotion on my face. He was there, sitting at the defendant's table, pale and hollow. He didn't look like the man who once sat at the defendant's tabletop, the empire with arrogance in his smile. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life building a kingdom, only to find it was made of glass. And I was the hammer the judge ruled in my favor. Ownership of the patents, and therefore the intellectual property at the heart of the company, belonged to my mother, and now legally to me. I didn't stop there. I pushed for posthumous recognition. Her name was reinstated as co-founder, her face placed on the wall in the main lobby. Her story finally told the board members who had been complicit resigned in disgrace. Two of them were indicted on charges of corporate fraud. As for my father, he lost everything. He wasn't even allowed to keep a seat on the board of directors. No retirement package, no settlement, nothing. I made sure of it. And Daniel, he resurfaced after the media storm tried to contact me, sent me some half-hearted apology wrapped in spiritual nonsense. I ignored it. He was a puppet, and he let himself be used. I didn't need his remorse. I needed peace after everything settled. I walked through the now empty executive wing. My mother's old office had been locked for years. I opened it. Everything was exactly how she left it. Her books, her sketches, the framed photo of me as a child on her desk. I stood there for a long time, letting the silence wrap around me for the first time in years. I didn't feel anger. I felt a quiet kind of pride. Her story would no longer be buried under someone else's ego. Her legacy was no longer a footnote. She was seen, remembered, honored. And as I sat in her chair staring out over the skyline she once dreamed of dominating, I realized something. I didn't want to be CEO. I didn't want to rule the empire. I had already done what I came to do. I left the company in the hands of a trusted former colleague, someone who had once worked under my mother and understood the soul of the company. I stepped away, not in defeat, but in peace. Let them build something new. Let them carry her torch. I had fought my war, uncovered the truth, and restored what was lost.